Thank you, everybody, for taking time to participate in this talk by Dr. Lesley Pullen. I'm sure you have read the biography that comes with a poster, and yes, you can see it is a illustrious career punctuated by academic excellence Dr. Lesley Pullen earned her master's and PhD in 2008 and 2017 at SOAS and while doing both degrees, she also taught a great deal in the Southeast Asian art module at the SOAS postgraduate diploma as well as VNA. She's also done a lot of lecturing for a number of institutions on Southeast Asian art, Southeast Asian textiles. But I just want to highlight that Lesley came into her academic career very late in her life, and it just shows that she's a woman with her priorities right. You know, she entered academia after she's enjoyed life, traveling around and living in exciting cities, raising 3 kids. But I want to also say that her work is exemplary of how a person can turn what started as a hobby into a passion. And she's turned a passion and take it to another level, and she's turned it into a lifelong, very serious pursuit, and ended up in academia. So congratulations to Dr. Pullen on that. So a word about the topic we're about to hear from Dr. Pullen today. It is a topic that's always bugging students like ourselves on Southeast Asian textiles. The issue of when did Southeast Asians start to weave? What kind of textile did they weave? Unfortunately, our lovely tropical circumstances are very, very good for living and very comfortable, is completely destructive to organic fibers, and hence we really don't have good evidence of Southeast Asian textiles anytime earlier than late 18th century and 19th century. So this issue is a troubling one. We all each try to find evidence in rather oblique manner in the most unlikely areas. But Dr. Pullen, she takes the bull by its horns, and she goes to study the textile patterns that appear on the classical sculptures. And it's really a courageous and tremendous task that she's done. So the effort is completely admirable. It ends up as her PhD thesis, which she then published as into just this year into a really nice publication called the Patent Splendor, Textiles Evidence in Classical Javanese Sculpture. And this forms the basis of her talk today. So without further ado, I would like to pass the floor now to Dr. Lesley Pullen. Lesley, please.
Thank you, Cholin. Wow, that's a splendid introduction. I really appreciate all your kind words, and I hope I live up to expectations. So I'd firstly like to thank Gwen and Josephine and her excellent team at TPA for bringing this all together, for making the superb poster that you've all seen, and to Cholin for moderating this talk. So let me explain. This book, Patent Splendor, is really the first time that a book has been published which covers a selected choice of sculptures from Central and East Java, which are not part of an exhibition or museum or private collection. For me, I think that's a very important point to note, that it's a completely independent choice, that nobody has told me I have to study these sculptures. So they were chosen because of their unique design of the textile patterns, and yet nobody really has attempted to put together this group of sculptures before, which leaves this book as a central piece of work in the field of Javanese art history for students, teachers, and future scholars alike. It clearly highlights how the economics of the time focused on trade in and around Java and Sumatra, which were central points in the international trade at that time, running through this 8th through the 15th centuries. And this is what we're going to look at. So here is the layout of the book, the 5 chapters with the sections beforehand and after. And I want to explain to you as to why I made this book and how it came together. So it really started with a visit to the Volkenkunden in Leiden, which is the sculptures you see at the top there. These were my babies, as I call them. This is what got me going. And I was a postgraduate student in Asian art history, as Chor stated, in 1998. It was a long time ago. I just arrived back from India, and my husband had been then posted to London. So I started my studies only then in academia and changed careers completely. And I saw these Singhasari sculptures with their incredible textile patterns and wondered how, what makes these patterns like this? Why has nobody done any work on that? Anyhow, to tighten up the timeline, I embarked on my PhD after my SOAS. I decided to do it part-time, which means you have a lot more time in the English system. Otherwise, it's only 3 years, which is far too short. So it gave me time to do proper research. So in 2010, what I did was begin to look at textiles, not so much at the sculptures. What textiles in Java and indeed in Sumatra or Malay Peninsula were reflected in these sculptures. So that was how I began, without actually looking for more sculptures themselves. In our system in London, after 2 years, you're allowed to take field research. So in 2012, I traveled for 2 months in Indonesia and in Australia to start to research further. I went to all the museums in Java and to 2 or 3 museums in Australia. I was invited to lecture in Jakarta, also in Canberra and in Sydney. I met a lot of people. We had many discussions, but it became quite evident that something very much was missing from my research at this time. What was an important factor was maps. When you look at past books, most books on textiles will have one map that shows at the front or the back, but it's quite evident when I started the book that my publisher said what we need is maps. So how to create your own maps. I spoke to John Mixick especially, and he tells me that he and Gyok make their own maps. Well, that seemed to be beyond me. I was good at lots of things, but making maps was not my thing. So I found a map maker, the Oxford Cartographer Limited here in England, and spent the whole of the first period of our lockdown last year designing these 5 maps. Now, what you see on the screen now is the first map of this group. This was the hardest of all of them to draw because what to put in and what to leave out. So I created the charts, as you see down on the left-hand side of your screen, which really covers the key areas that I wanted to explain to you, the reader, what was important in this region. And of course, where you're sitting in Singapore, my favorite place in the whole world, where I lived for just less than 2 years in the 90s. And I've traveled back to many times myself. I know many Singaporeans and people who live in Malaysia, that this is the choke point of this great international trade world between China, southern China, mainland Southeast Asia, and of course, South Asia and India, and further on to the Persian world. And so because of this, as all of you know, I'm sure, that Palembang, which was known as Srivijaya, and here Jambi, which was known as Melayu Jambi, were the key jumping off points for all of these traders. And it was really Peter Lee who wrote in his famous book, Sarong Kebaya, he said, quote, "The history of Chinese presence in insular Southeast Asia is still incompletely understood." And it's really,
sorry, Dr. Lesley, can I interrupt
yes.
you for a second? Because there's a small box in the middle of your presentation. Could you maybe reshare the slides, please?
reshare them. This box won't go away. It seems to be here all the time.
Maybe you could try resharing the presentation just to see if it goes away.
So what do I need to do? Stop share?
Yeah, just stop sharing and try it again. Yeah. So sorry about that.
But if I do that, I have to close the presentation and open a new one.
Yeah. Could you just try that and see if it works? Sorry, everyone, for the technical difficulties.
Does that appear to be okay?
You have to share it again. Could you try sharing it on your side? Yeah, we can just click on the green button, the share screen button, and try and share it again. Sorry, Sylvia. Sylvia, could you stop sharing, please? Sylvia? Sylvia. Yes, thank you. Dr. Lesley, could you try sharing it again? Is it everything okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. It seems to work. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Lesley.
Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. Why is it? There's always a gremlin that upsets the system every time. One more thing I wanted to say about this area. Another fact that I'm sure many of you know, but just to highlight, of course, that this area was central to Chinese Buddhist monks who traveled from China, from this region up here from this region, of course, down through Palembang and up into Nalanda in India. And they stayed for 2 or 3 years, 2 or 3 months, or possibly up to years, to learn the text before they traveled on. And because of this travel of monks backwards and forwards that we gained this lot of the sculptures that we're going to look at. So what of these sculptures? So this book became about images itself, not just textiles, but about the sculptures. From pieces as large as this over 4 meters high Mahakala that stands in the National Museum in Jakarta, down to very, very small bronzes, as small as 10 centimeters. Now the proportion, if I made it quite in proportion, you wouldn't see that bronze at all. So the point being that to research these and to understand their textile patterns by looking at the sculptures themselves is almost impossible. So what did we have to do? We're going to have to take the textile patterns off the sculptures and analyze them. And that's what I'll discuss in a moment. But so you'll see some of the designs here on the screen now. But this really was the issue. Then I just want to make a point. You might think of, why am I talking about Javanese sculptures to a Peranakan association? But of course, all of you know, as part of this organization, that the Chinese were involved in trade in this region for at least back to the 5th, 6th century. The impact wasn't that great at that stage, but from about the 10th century onwards, during the Tang period, there was strong evidence of Chinese art and design, and that's what we will see in the sculptures. So I'm going to take you to 2 images here. It became apparent when I returned to London that the photos of sculptures alone was not enough to highlight these complex designs drawn on the patterns. Now this little piece at the bottom here, this piece is really quite small, as you can see from the details. On these slides, in the orange box on the left, you will always see in white writing the detail of the sculptures. So I'm not going to read that out, just you can pick that up yourself. And most of the time the textile pattern is drawn beside it. So I decided after researching the sculptures for a year or more that I needed a designer. So I advertised at the Royal College of Art in London, which was very close to my apartment in Kensington. And 4 people answered my advertisements. And what I'd done is I sent them out a drawing of a Central Javanese sculpture and one of East Java. On Central Java, my remit was please make a textile pattern that replicated the lower half of the body, as you see here in these drawings. And for the East Javanese sculptures, which were much bigger and mostly in stone, please take the textile pattern off the body and create it as a flat sheet of material. This was what I asked for. I got 4 replies, which was pretty good because I wasn't expecting any replies, very quickly. And only one person did this exactly as I wanted. Her name was Yiran Huang. She was a young Chinese girl from Shenzhen, and she was studying design, mostly drawing was her remit at the Royal College of Art. She and I liked each other immediately, and I employed her to do the drawing. So we worked together for 18 months. And I would sit in my apartment and we would look at the sculptures in detail, of course, on big computer screens. And she understood exactly what I wanted. So while she was completing her MA, she did work for me, of which we paid her every couple of months to cover the work. And it became really central to my book and the PhD beforehand, because I think without these drawings, what you're looking at, especially when you look at this sculpture here, you're really not sure what you're actually looking at. So I think the drawings itself has made a huge difference. So now I'd like to take you back to the beginning. We've got 2 periods of history, Central and East Java, but they are divided down into slightly different periods as well. So on this slide, we have 3 sculptures. This one on the right here is very much reflected in the Indian style. What I mean by the Indian style, in the Pala period of Northeast India from about 10th to 12th century, there were a lot of Javanese sculptures made. And many of these ended up in Java themselves. But many of them are similar in style. What we also feel that a lot of the traders and the Buddhist monks brought the sculptures to Indonesia. But I think what also happened is they brought the idea of sculpting to Indonesia. So in Java, many sculptures were made. Sorry? Somebody's talking in the background. Many sculptures were made by probably Indian designers, but in Java. The difference being is that a lot of the Indian sculptures have no textile patterns, very, very few of them. So it's really only the pieces that we see in Java themselves where the textile pattern started to appear. The next problem I had is how to define these sculptures. How was I going to catalogue them or categorize them? What was the grouping going to be? Because they couldn't just appear as a random collection in the book. So it became apparent in Central Java that there was no cohesive timeline from a dating point of view. So I chose to look at as many designs as I could, and I put them together in pattern types. So this is what you're seeing here for the small circles and dots, pattern types, which was the earliest, I think really the earliest period, the simplest of designs. And what I've showed you on the left-hand side of the screen, as there's some textile examples from India of block printed textiles, which are about the earliest evidence, and bandhani or tie-dyed. But there is also textiles in China showing designs of this nature as well. So the big question that I came with this, my PhD in the book is, where were the influences that made these designs, or were the Javanese making the textiles themselves? And that's what Cholin has highlighted in her introduction. So this is the questions that we're going to answer. What I want you to bring your attention to, this piece here is referred to as the early East Java style. So we're moving on to about the 11th century now, and we have a very slender type of body. This piece has become very Javanese. very unlike the piece on the right side, which still has a physiognomy that is much more in the parlor Indian style. The decoration of the ornamentation here is very blobby and rather spiky. The casting of the bronze is not nearly as refined as the piece on the right. And the little Brahma in the middle in gold is something that would never be made in India. So we know that this has no outside Indian influence and is a distinctly Javanese piece in itself. So we move slightly forward in history to the beginning, early Kadiri, which is the beginning of the East Javanese period. Now this is, the East Javanese period is divided just into three. We have Kadiri, the Singhasari, and the Majapahit period. And I hope some of you know these names. The Kadiri period has been written about, or certainly the Ganesha, by Eddie Siddhiwati, who did the most marvelous book on the Ganesha during East Java. But the one that comes out mostly is this Boro Ganesha, which has been published so many times by many people in Indonesian publications and also in Western publications. But what's interesting about it is John Guy, who's written about sculptures and textiles in this region many times, and I'm sure a lot of you know his name. He described this textile, and I'm going to use my favorite tool now here, as a batik kawung pattern. Well, indeed, that's the first time I'm going to use this word. It is a kawung pattern, which is the interlocking circles, which of course you all know very well. But this is not batik, and it is not an Indian trade cloth, which is also been the suggestion. The important aspect I want you to realize that this object around the waist here is not part of the textile. It's a belt, metal belt, or a girdle is probably the correct word. And then coming across the front of the body here is the sash, which is the pattern I've showed the drawing here. So the drawing clearly shows that this was a brocaded fabric of some sort with a border along the edge. For those of you who really know textiles, this would be a metal gimp of some sort. Gimp is the word they use. They would do looping wire design, which is something that's known in Southeast Asia all over in different textiles today. And this is the only evidence we have of this particular design happening at this period. But what we need to highlight with this Ganesha as well, for those of you who know the attributes of Ganesha, normally it's a tusk and the cup that he has his tusk into, the tooth, sorry, here. But also on the back of the body is this kala and the skulls along the base, and of course an inscription around the bottom. So this is the earliest evidence we have of any tantric iconography or esoteric skulls of any sort on any sculptures, and with that's going to become more apparent. Now this feature never appears at all in Central Java, even though in Central Java, we have Hinduism and Buddhism rubbing nicely along side by side. The word syncretism is sometimes used by students, but that is probably not the word. These two religions really were married quite nicely together, and this becomes quite evident in the sculptures. We then have another example that shows you of dated 1260, which is now in the Singhasari period. But this statue does not follow Singhasari actual pattern traditions, and I'll explain to you at the moment. So now it gets a little complicated. So this piece is in the Tropen Museum in Leiden, in Amsterdam, sorry, and it's almost impossible to photograph because this sculpture, this piece actually comes from the museum collection, but it's stuck in a box in a very bad cabinet, very difficult to see. And without detailed photography, which was all taken by my husband, we wouldn't know that he had such a detailed textile pattern as you can see here. If you look carefully, the kawung design is quite clear on the lower hip cloth with a very detailed brocaded pattern on the belt, the sashes across his legs. And this is what has been drawn by the designs on the right. So this really highlights what Yiran was able to do. She looked at the sculpture, and of course, to draw the lower half of the body now, you wouldn't really see the textile. So she lifted it off the sculpture and very much placed it on a piece of paper. And that's what, so you're now able to see the designs of these sculptures. Now we know that this is a Singhasari period bordering on Majapahit period because of the depiction of the lotus here, and that's would be a whole different lecture, and I don't want to spend too much time on sculpture iconography as we want to look more at the textiles themselves. We then come to the key Singhasari period. Now this is one of my babies that was on the screen right at the beginning, that comes from Chandisinghasari, that's in the Leiden Museum, the World Museum. Now, this is a guardian figure. There are two of them. The other one we will see later, that stands at the entrance to Chandisinghasari in Malang in East Java. It was removed from there by way back in about 1820. The gentleman who worked along with Raffles, he took many of the sculptures to his garden on the north coast of Java, and then they were removed to Netherlands back in the 19th century. So of course they've been out of the weather for a long time. So apart from his nose and some detail of the hands, he's not damaged at all. So if you look carefully at this drawing, which really highlights the textile pattern, but what it's done is also highlights that this sculpture is wearing an upper body garment. You can see clearly from the drawing that there is a line in the middle. And if I go backwards and show it to you again, here's the line in the middle going underneath the sash, and we move it down. You can see the garment finishes here across the top of the shoulder, and then it's decorated with this plain sash. Now the sash we refer to as a slendang, and all of you, I know in the Malay world what this is. Many scholars have called these sashes across the body the upavita, which is the sacred thread worn by a lot of Indian sculptures. But this is not the upavita. This is a sash, which is a very Javanese feature. And you'll see this appearing time and time again in our Javanese sculptures. So we will look more at this, and I'll discuss this textile pattern a little later. And then the last period, the second to last period, this extraordinary sculpture was on display for 3 months only in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg in Russia. Nobody has written about it apart from one German man in the 19th century. It's never been seen before. It's never been published anywhere except for in this book, except for in German, again, in a German catalogue. So this is, I brought you something new that nobody's seen. Now this is supposed to represent the young King Krotanagara, who was built the Chandisinghasari. And he's here represented as Harihara Ardhanari, which is half Shiva, half Vishnu. He's also half male and half female. But what's extraordinary about him is when you look at the textile pattern, it's quite the most detailed lower body garment. Now I'm going to go back again and highlight this to you. So if you look closely here, this is evidently depicting a king. Nobody would decorate a sculpture with so much detail, with so much ornamentation, if it wasn't depicting a royal figure. But when we look at the textile, there is a line here across the body and then the line at the bottom. So you know that he's actually wearing two cloths, one over the top. This is a distinctively Indonesian Javanese feature. The Indian sculptures never do this at all. So it's quite distinctive for this period. We know that it's in the Singhasari period, the way of the lotus is curling up, very full and very luscious at the side of the body. You can feel the leaves, they're so soft. The ornamentation is very clear, very deep and very crisply carved. But this is now becoming quite distinctively in the Majapahit, the later period. So the textile, when I bring this back up again for you, is quite interesting because it's the two cloths have two different borders. Now, I'd like to discuss briefly this border design. If you look at this on the next slide here, the next picture, we're dealing now with the beginning of a banji pattern. And for all of you in the Chinese world, of course, you know exactly what that is. So this is my scarf, my lokchan that comes from North Java. and all of you know about lokchans, I'm sure. These Chinese silks were made very much with Chinese designs, many of them with this banji design, which appears a lot in Javanese architecture, batik patterns today, and it appears on quite a few of the sculptures. So it's really the earliest evidence we have of a distinctively Chinese design. Now, it's not to say that this banji design is also very popular in Hindu art too, Hindu and Buddhist art in some instances. But in this world, because of the Javanese connection, I think we refer to it probably as more of a Chinese inspiration. And then the last period is the Majapahit period. And now our sculptures have taken on a very static, upright, rather wooden stance. They're always very solid. They always have a very long textile, which we now call sinjang. The sinjang is the word for a long cloth, and the text tell us that this is the word that we use. In the earlier period, many of the time in my book, I refer to it as a kain, which of course, as you all know, is the general word for a cloth in itself, a cotton cloth. But if I highlight this for you, you'll note that the textile is very heavy now. And we have very distinctive Kung designs on both the bodies. On the sash that comes across, this one is actually plain, but right down to the ankles. You know exactly that the person is wearing a long cloth and covered and adorned with heavy, heavy ornamentation, which is made from pearls, these pieces here, and this would be some form of beaten gold with gold finials at the end. The lotus pattern Lotus is now depicting from a pot, which is a distinctive Majapahit design. So here are the two textiles drawn on the left, and I put a modern batik from Bima Sakti, which I visited in Java a number of years ago, to show you the continuity of this design. And these are some of the earliest evidences that we had in Java from this very distinctive pattern. So I think one feature I did with this book, at the end of each chapter, the three core chapters at the middle of the book, chapter 3, 4, and 5, I created these charts, and the charts contain all the textile patterns from that section of the book with the number correlating to the sculpture in the book. And what it gives you, as I go through these now, is an idea of how these were grouped together in pattern types. And if you look carefully, you'll see that the sculptures one after the other are following a certain pattern type. And as we go through these, the designs start to change and morph from the simple circles we see here, and suddenly we start appearing with these extraordinary detailed brocaded patterns. And as we come to the end of that period, we get these, then suddenly we see an upper body garment. And this is the detail that's, one of these appears on the front cover of the flyer that the wonderful Josephine created. And then suddenly you come to the Chandisinghasari period, and at the end of chapter 4, the sculpture designs change completely. So if I go through the next few pages, you'll see it's a complete departure from the Central Javanese, quite different. All sorts of interesting designs start to appear, from these circles to brocaded patterns with star designs, the little 8-petaled rosettes that we looked at earlier, and these extraordinary bands. Where did all of this come from? It's so different from Central Java. And then suddenly we get all these Ganeshas, on the Ganeshas, we get these Kala heads and one-eye Kalas. And these extraordinary designs referred to as Chandra Kapala. And then you get to the Majapahit period and these designs completely disappear. So I turn the page again. These are the patterns that we see on Prajnaparamita, along with these ones at the top here. And these extraordinary sash patterns from Prajnaparamita as well. And here is the Harihara, the tall statue of Krotanagara we saw. And then we get right to the end and we come to the Majapahit period, and what you're looking at here is they're all the same. Suddenly they're all versions of the Kung design. Quite extraordinary. And right at the end, I have two designs here by the 15th century. the Majapahit period has really changed completely. And now we have many images of Bhima and Kotolo, and we'll look at that right at the end. And we jump briefly to Sumatra, and we have lots of tantric images of dancing figures with these extraordinary hip wrappers. So now we've gone through all the textile designs, I'm going to take you back to the beginning again and back to India. So what we're seeing here is images of the Nalanda Mahavira, where I was fortunate enough to visit a few years ago and to take my own photographs. So many of the pilgrims from abroad visited the sacred sites of Buddhism, such as this monastery of Nalanda and Vikramshila in Bihar. And the idea that textile patterns and Indian culture arrived from India has been suggested, but that Indonesia did not derive its notions of Indian culture from only one or two parts of the continent, as contacts were also made with many regions of the Indian subcontinent, where there were centers of Buddhist art in eastern India, but also we have Hinduism arrived from contacts with the Chola in south and western India. And this is very important to remember, that the Chola had an incursion in a period of time in South India in around the 10th century, and did have an impact in design on the central Javanese sculptures. And it was during most of the Hindu-Buddhist period, however, the more significant influence was felt mostly from Northeast India, and was really the starting point for Indian artistic inspiration in the region. So before we look at any more sculptures, I think we need to look briefly at the Chandis that were the center point for why these sculptures were made. So I'm sure many of you have visited Borobudur and Prambadan, which is just across the water for you. Fortunately, I've seen all of these Chandis and been there many times, but what you never saw was any freestanding sculptures still in situ. Almost all of them had disappeared and are now in museums or private collections. But what you do have, of course, is many miles of relief sculpture. Now, this book and my PhD were only ever about freestanding sculpture. I promised myself from the beginning I would not study relief sculpture at all. But having said that, relief sculpture does tell us what is happening at the time. It does show us sartorial style. It tells us what people looked at, what they were wearing, what they were carrying, what ornamentation was being used at the time. And that's very important as to help us analyze what we saw on the sculptures, the freestanding sculptures. But during this period were many, many small icons produced, some carried in from India, but a lot of them made locally, put in niches or used for personal worship. And then we move to the East Javanese period, and I have the dates up. We'd have the two key Chandi here, Chandi Jago at the top, and the bottom one is the famous Chandisinghasari. I hope some of you have been to see these. Chandi Jago in the long run is actually the more interesting building. It has many miles, again, of very fine relief panels all the way around the side, very, very different to Borobudur. But Chandisinghasari is a strange anomaly because it was definitely unfinished. There is detail up the top here, but the bottom half is completely plain. But the most important thing about it is that the key sculpture, the Singhasari sculpture that are the most, that I refer to as my babies, were found in the niches around this Shaivite Chandi. So why was this one king, Kritanagara, who built this particular Chandi that would never finished before he died, created these extraordinary sculptures with these extraordinary textile patterns just for this one Chandi and nowhere else? Why was it so different? And then we finished up with the Majapahit period with Chandi Panataran. This is the base of the main stake temple, which would have had a wooden superstructure. And once again, there are many, many relief sculptures. And we'll see at the end of the lecture, there will be a Dvarapala, which is a guardian figure, which is placed right here at the entrance to the Chandi. So now we will look at a few Central Javanese statues, some of the most famous pieces. And this, of course, is probably one of the most well-known of all. This not so small, silver Manjushri, you can see he's 28 centimeters. seated in this classic position of a youthful figure of Manjushri Kumara Bhutta. We know it's Manjushri because he holds the lotus in his hand and he has the small book on the top. But the other aspect I want you to look at is not only the iconography of the little hair curls, the very Indian ear ornaments. Is this necklace here is totally South Indian. This is a very un-Javanese aspect. No other sculpture in Java other than Manjushris wear a necklace of this sort. And it is believed by Jan Fontaine, who died a number of years ago, but who wrote extensively on Javanese material, that this could have been brought in from India, but I suspect it wasn't. I think it's Javanese made, but made probably by an Indian merchant, artist. Because of if you look at the line across his eyebrow line is a very distinctive feature that appears in Indian sculpture and not in Javanese sculpture. His textile pattern is quite interesting. It's quite detailed. I put a couple of examples here at the bottom of the Newbury collection. For those of you who know about this, is a collection of textile fragments in cotton that's in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. These were all researched and catalogued by Dr. Ruth Barnes, who was the curator there at the time. And they represent an enormous repository of material that was found, a lot of them in Fushtat in Egypt, very dry conditions, known as the Indo-Egyptian cottons. So they were made in Western India and traded to Egypt. But then many of them were also traded to Java, and certain sections of them were found in Java, very similar in designs to the one found in Egypt. Now, of course, I cannot say at all that the textile in this Manjushri is this particular fabric. Obviously, I can't say that, but what I am saying is that it's very similar in idea, and these textiles were obviously available at the time. But also I want to highlight here, and I'll just say it this first time, that people who carve textiles, who carve sculpture, don't make up the designs out of their own ideas. They don't suddenly look at this and say, I think I'll just draw a pretty picture here and make this pattern. It didn't work that way. An artisan will do what he's told to do. He will follow the shastras that tell him the layout and the order that the sculpture should be in and the proportions. But the textile pattern he would not make up. He would have been representing something that he saw, be it imported or locally made at the time. These two are really, really interesting, the pair of Shiva and Parvati that we see here. These both are gold in the National Museum. Very difficult to see now. As far as I know, I haven't been there for a few years, not only during our COVID time, but I haven't traveled to Java for about 4 years now. So I believe there's been changes at the National Museum, and I don't know whether they're still on display or not. But what we're looking at is two distinctive body styles. If you look at the left, what the Shiva is wearing is totally Indian. This is an Indian dhoti, which is the word for a South Indian garment that's pulled up between the legs, tucked into the girdle at the back of the body and tied off at the side, which is exactly what we're seeing here. This piece of gold at the side here is a sash that's tied. And one thing the Javanese were very good at was depicting the detail of the sculpture itself, how the sash is worn, how the belt is worn, how the fabric is actually used, that you're actually looking at the actual cloth. You feel you can touch it. So on the right with the Parvati, there, of course, it's quite different. Here you can see that the textile is actually folded over at the front and comes down to her mid on her calf. This is not Indian at all. No Indian wears a textile like this. This is completely Indonesian style. So what I propose to you, and this is where I throw a question out to all of you in the audience, is after many years of research, this design for me represents the kumi kumi, which is that octopus design that appears on tapis from Lampung in South Sumatra. So is it possible that this sculpture was made in Sumatra and traded to Java? made in Java by a Sumatran who knew of these textiles. Was this Lampung design still was being made in the 9th, 10th century? Was that possible? We have no other evidence, early evidence of textiles of this design. In my opinion, this pattern is the only one of its kind, nothing else like this. So this sculpture is really quite unique for that reason. Now I'm going to show you some stone here because I want you to look at these patterns of scrolling lotus designs that we see at the top here, and especially in this roundel. So you may think of them as just relief carving, but actually what we're looking at is what's referred to as the extra leaves from the lotus patterning. So when a flower is created, then the sculptors always make this abundant design of the lotus flower. And this is what you're seeing on the sculpture here. And this we're going to look at who this textile pattern belongs to in the next slide. But I want you to just bear in mind this relief carving, which is from Pagan in Myanmar, with the roundel designs with the duck in the middle, with the same sort of flowing, abundant lotus pattern as well, because this is a design that we're going to discuss shortly. So at the top here, we have Manjushri Arapachana. Now this sculpture is probably on the front of my book. It appears as the key sculpture on the book. He was only ever seen once in Germany in around the late 18th, early 19th century on exhibition. Then he disappeared. He has not been seen again. He's barely been published. He is now in St. Petersburg, and it's a long story about how he got there. And for those of you interested more in Manjushri, I've recently written an article that's been published in Humaniora at UGM, and it's online. It's also on my academia webpage. So the sculpture of Manjushri is in almost perfect condition, but what we're interested in is this extraordinary textile pattern. Now, Yuren took 2 or 3 goes to get this right, and she has created the most incredible design, which absolutely replicates what you're seeing here. If we look closely, it's just incredible that this sculpture dates from the late 12th century, has been away in a museum since the early 19th century, but that it's still in such perfect condition. So when you look at the patterns here, we're seeing mythical animals coming out of these foliate designs. Now, where did these animals come from, and where did the inspiration from these animals and the foliate designs, where did this come from? So that's why I showed you the relief sculpture in the earlier slide, but also these mythical animals. We see nothing like this in Indonesia. We see elephants in Java. We've seen those at Borobudur. But this particular animal here and like this are not seen in any today, or Sumatra or in Malay Peninsula in any form of art history at all. So where did these come from? So it took me a number of years of research to try and find out, and it's very evident that this is Sasanian. Sasanian designs that moved through China, through the Silk Route along North China, and ended up down in Java. It's quite interesting as to whether a textile ever appeared like this, or ideas traveled through to create this particular pattern. But what's intriguing is this extraordinary detail of the border, which appears on the lower leg here. I think it's quite interesting that there's just one sculpture only, and this comes in Candi Jago, which is part of King Krotanegara's grouping of sculptures, but it is, literally on its own. I'd just like to read you this quote. It comes from a scholar, Savanda Dode, who writes about Central Asian textiles. And what she says, I quote, "Textiles are a very important part of historical evidence. They also play an important art historical source for ornamental patterns found in other forms of decorative art. Costly and beautiful imported silks have always been a source of inspiration for local artists, who copied images from foreign textiles onto their own items of their own art tradition. And I thoroughly agree with Savanda. It's exactly what I have done here. And this is exactly what is happening in Java as it did in Central Asia, is things are imported and then the inspiration is put onto the sculpture. Now I'm going to take you away from Indonesia for a moment to some more designs that will appear on the next sculpture. So we're looking back to Western India, to Ajanta, to the Ajanta caves. I'm sure some of you have heard about Ajanta, where we have fantastic paintings. I've visited Ajanta many years ago when I lived in India. In those days, you could actually still see the cave paintings. Now they've shut off the caves because too many tourists and too much breath has started to deteriorate them. So I'll give you a close-up. What I'm interested in is the duck paintings here on these what would be Indian block printed textiles. We look down at this one. Excuse me. This would also have been representing ikat textiles, which would have probably come in from West Asia, so further west from India. If we look on the other side, here is another example of one of these Newbury collection cottons in the Ashmolean with the small duck design. These are all early period patterns that were traded. And then we go back to the Kubachi reliefs that I was just talking about. And these sculptures here, these relief sculptures, are covered in textile patterns, many of them reflected in what we see in Java. Nowhere else do we see any other version of ducks in Indonesia other than in the next sculpture I'm going to show you, except what we see here carved onto the sculptures. So we look at the next slide. This is a detail of Parvati, who's reflecting Central Asian patterns. Now the Parvati, and I'll show you a picture of her again right at the end. She's stored, she's freestanding, and she remains in Chandisinghasari. So she's outside and has been outside all this time. So the stone is quite badly exfoliated. And if I show you a close up, you'll see what I mean by exfoliation. The outer layer of the stone wears away. And of course, the weather itself has worn away the stone. But if you look closely, here you'll see a roundel. And it's quite clear that that is a duck within the roundel. You see the head of the duck, and there is the body. Now, the other ones are not quite distinctive, but Yuran spent a lot of time studying these, and this is what she came up with her design. There were obviously other animals in the other roundels. So this is very much what we see in Sasanian textiles from West Asia, and they must have brought in something like this, as we see the two examples I've showed you here, the ducks on the top one, and in this Jain painting. Many Jain paintings are also wonderful examples of textile patterns, all of them, many of them with duck designs on them. And Sasanian silks were imported into China and then often replicated in the Chinese world. So we have this movement of textiles from Sasanian world to India, to other forms of Chinese art and design, especially in the Song and very early Yuan period, but mostly in the Song period, and then must have ended up in Java. Otherwise, why would you see this on this sculpture? One sculpture only. Then I'll bring you to this very interesting Brahma. Now he remains in situ on view in the collection in the world, in the museum in Volkenkunden in Leiden. He's huge, as you can see from the measurements. He's quite damaged, but the bits that matter are not damaged. So you'll notice from the picture on the bottom right of the textile design is quite clear still. And it actually depicted on the sash. And what I love about the Javanese artisans is they really knew what they were doing. They knew that a sash would fold over and lay across the body, and they made the design across the fold, which is quite incredible. The sophistication of it, if you look at this circle here, it actually goes across the fold properly as though it's folded. But what of this design? Where did this particular motif come from? Now, this appears on one other sculpture as well, which I'll show you a little later, very similar, almost identical. But it doesn't appear anywhere else, just on this one only. So I found this drawing at the top, which again comes from the Kubachi reliefs, which we call the harp player, which is wearing, if you look at his design and this one here, it's very similar, the idea of these large rosette patterns, one on top of the other. We do also look at the circle here at the bottom, and we're looking at a detail of Pagan roof paintings in Pagan from the 11th, 12th century, where there were many, many images of kings being adored by the different priests and monks at the time. So the kings always with a robe and the monks with bare-chested. And many of them are depicted with patterns of concentric circles of rosettes. Now, a scholar called Claudine Barthes-Pricron, a French lady, has written extensively on Pagan, and she looks a lot at the inspiration from India, but there was also a lot of inspiration from China as well, because there was trade in both directions in Pagan. And Pagan being a big Buddhist center, there was also a lot of trade and movement down through the Malay Peninsula to Java. So all of these ideas move constantly. So many of them are indigenous, the ground up, but they also came into the region. So I think I'd just like to bring in at this stage the name of the scholar Jan Wiseman Christie, who very sadly died earlier this year. And she had done much of her PhD work and many years of studies afterwards on the SEMA tax charters. And they were tax charters that described who could do what and give what to who in Javanese life, basically, dating from about the 9th to the 12th century. And these charters describe weavers, they describe the type of textile, the name of it, what the pattern we don't know, but it also describes the loom with different terms of Xinjiang, the word tuliswana, drawing with color, or tulis mat, drawing with gold. We know that the Javanese were making brocaded textiles, meaning a songket for all of you today. We know that the Javanese traded textiles to China and that China sent their own textiles back to Java, all through these tax charters. So there was a huge movement of art and design through this period, from China, through Java, Sumatra, to India, backwards and forwards. So it was a huge entrepot. Now, I'll bring you on to one of my favorite sculptures. Now, this is the detail of a Persian parameter that's at Chandigum Kung, came from Chandigum Kung in Muara Jambi. I was fortunate enough to be invited to Jambi for a conference many years ago. It was the first Jambi International Conference. Sadly, very sadly, they never had the second or the third, but I went to the first, and there was a publication that came out with all the speakers. And at that time, I chose to lecture on the Pracha Paramita and her textile patterns that are at Jambi. She has a really interesting design, and well, I'll show you the rest of it in a while. But what we're looking at here is the hip wrapper with the detail of, so I'll bring you on a close up here. So here is the circle on the hip wrapper, but it's the border pattern I want to discuss at the moment. You can see clearly defined across the lower leg. This is the sacred thread, a group of pearl chains with a gold finial that's folded across her leg. So here is Yiran's drawing with the detail of the design. So I spent a long time wondering where this came from. Where do we see motifs like this? And of course, what we're looking at in my analysis today is Songket Limar, Palembang Songket Limar, with the Songket across the here, but the Limar is the weft ikat, with a very similar border design to what we're seeing here, which is what we have here on the sculpture itself. But where does this come from? And I'm sure all of you know what this is referred to, which is known as the tumpul. And this is an Indian trade textile, the patola textiles that came in huge quantities to Java and Sumatra, but not quite at this period. I think they came in later. There was no evidence of this triangular temple design on any of the Javanese sculpture, which to me is indicative that patola itself, like this, was not known in this early period, maybe slightly later than this, but not at this early period. So what they had created was their own version of this border pattern, which then developed into something else. And that's what we're seeing in textiles that we know today and for the last 150 years. Other than that, of course, they've all disintegrated. But this sculpture is really our earliest evidence of this kind of border design. Now I'm going to take you back to this. This is the guardian figure I showed you earlier on when I showed you the whole body, upper body. But now we want to research the textile itself. So I inherited this sonket on the right, which is my textile, from my mother-in-law's great aunt who lived in Palembang in about the 1920s. So this is an absolute classic sonket with a temple design at the border with all over gold. It's a beautiful piece. It's in good condition. And I remember when I was first given this, soon after I started my PhD, in fact, I realized that the sculpture that I'm looking at, this Nandishvara, is carrying exactly the same textile. How could it not be representing anything other than the same thing? So it's quite natural to assume that this very deep 3D carving is a brocade cloth, and what this guardian figure of a royal temple could quite likely have been carved with a sonket textile as in his royal position to wear such a cloth. But also I show you at the bottom here, these two are Buddhist textiles that are often used to wrap boxes that contain Buddhist text in Japan. And we're seeing the same 8-petal rosette, the same sort of design. So it's this type of patterning is very popular in the Buddhist world, as well as in our Malay sonket world. So it's a motif that carries through also from China. It was very popular in Tang China period. We see a lot of this design in that period. So it appears in the Japanese Buddhist world, and here it is on a Hindu figure reflected now in a Malay textile. So here we're now going to look at a sculpture of Durga. Now this Durga Mahishasuramardini is a classic Hindu figure. But this particular one is unique to Chandisinghasari. So she is also one of my babies that appears in that very first picture from the Leiden Museum. So she appears in one of those niches in Singhasari, Chandisinghasari. She's unique to Java. All the Durgas that appear in India, none of them are like this. And if you go to the National Museum in Jakarta, there are many Durgas, but none of them are like this. They're all quite different. So she's distinctive to this one and only Chandi. But she also has many textile patterns on her, many different designs. But for the moment, we're just going to look at her lower Xinjiang. And what's interesting, when you look at the patterning here, the artisan knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't just make it up. He knew that a body draped in a heavy cloth would fold in this way. When you see the folds depicted like this, it's quite evident that this is a heavy textile. So I proposed through my PhD, and I will hold fast to this right through, that these sculptures were wearing a brocaded textile. They are not wearing a batik of some sort, cotton, meaning a textile with a cotton, because it wouldn't be depicted like this at all. So I show you, this is a sonket limar that I purchased myself in Palembang many years ago. This is a beautiful old antique piece. And it's the beginning of the sort of idea of what we're looking at, with the small rosette flowers that appear here within the bands. Here you can clearly see the band design known as rantai, or the chain patterns. So this sculpture actually has two different 3 or 4 different textile patterns. I'm just showing you one in this particular slide. But then I'll place this on the top. And when you look at a sonket today, it's just so clearly the idea of what's being created on here. I'll take it away again. Have a look at the sculpture, and I'll put the sonket back, and I'll leave it with you to decide. Now, this is the sculpture on the left that's at the front of the flyer that Josephine created for us. And I chose this one, even though it's not a particularly good looking statue, but because of its garment. So these 2 statues are known as Archer Leluhur, and Archer being the word for statue, and Leluhur being the word for ancestor. So these are not sacred, these are secular figures, ancestor characters. They're seated. The one on the right was probably found in Java and remains in the National Museum. And the one on the left is at a small temple complex called Bumi Ayu in central South Sumatra that I visited when I was doing working on my Jambi conference. So this is really a Hindu site, dates from about the 11th to the 13th century. So we're seeing 2 statues, and I'll really just discuss this one, with this upper body garment that finishes, let's have a close up at the sculpture. You can see it clearly comes around the body and finishes at the wrist and open at the neck. So there's no fastening here, but we have this, what would be a gold belt body underneath the breast that holds it together. And here is the pattern on the bottom. So the pattern is really representing, that reflects this Persian inspired design that we see on the left. If for those of you know, of course, the Tang cargo, I think, is still at the ACM, and I was fortunate enough to come and see the exhibition when it first opened. And of course, by then, all the designs of my sculptures were imprinted firmly into my head because I'd seen them so many times. So when I saw this motif on the left, which was a Persian inspired, for me, it became apparent that's what we're looking at here on the sculpture. So if we put these 2 together, it's quite clear this sort of design, it's not something we saw in Chinese art during the Tang period or early Song at all, but it's very evident. It's quite a popular Persian inspired motif. So how did this design get here into Sumatra in this period? Well, there is a port on the northwest coast, an ancient port, not a port now, called Baras, and many scholars have done a lot of work on this region and excavations, and so we know that this was very popular with Indo-Persian traders who would have brought in material, and various material has been found. And no doubt textiles, of course, traders always bring ceramics and textiles are the 2 things. And maybe something ended up in Bumi Ayu to create this design. Otherwise, I have no explanation as to how this pattern appeared on this one and only sculpture. Whereas the other one on the right-hand side is quite different, and that is more reflective of sort of block printed Indian textiles that we saw in Central Java. But I'd also just like to discuss briefly the word baju, which was initially derived from the Persian word badzu, which subsequently was then adopted into Malay language. And the term kabaya, used to describe a female blouse, was pinned together. It was probably derived from the Arabic word kaba or abaya, and the Arabic term habaya, meaning a long tunic. Now, Peter Lee, in his book, Sarang Kabaya, discusses this at great length. And I agree with totally his interpretation, and I hope that you will all agree with that's what we're seeing here. So in this, the Chinese commentary by Ma Huan in 1220, he writes, I quote, "In Java, women wore an upper garment, a short jacket with colored cloth, a baju with a V-shaped opening, and a wrapped skirt and shoulder cloth or slendang." So this is what we're seeing here. Admittedly, there's no slendang in this one, but we have a short jacket with a V-shaped opening. And this is the Bumi Ayu complex. Just briefly show you, all we have left is clay brick platforms covered. And these are the sculptures sitting in the site museum. So you'll see they're quite small. not in particularly good condition, but enough detail for us to do patterns of. So the map of Sumatra shows you Muara Jambi, that's where Bumi Ayu is in the middle. The Mahakala, we're going to look at him in a moment, we haven't seen him yet, and the relief dancers, which were on those, the drawings I showed you earlier. And there's a small bronze found in Borneo, which we haven't discussed. So I'm going to take you to these three images here. I was able to discuss with a number of Javanese scholars a few years ago as to how do we look at sculptures? How do we interpret what we're seeing on them? And they both, certainly one of the gentlemen had said to me that we look at the sculpture first, then we read the text, and third, we look at ethnography and compare it to material that we see today. So here it is, the Nandishwar again that we looked at earlier. And then we look at these photographs that come from this wonderful book by De Witt, was in 1912, which really talks about her travels through Java and these street dancers wearing the upper body garment that you'll notice here is exactly what's seen on the Nandishwar. Totally the same idea. If I bring you a close up, joined in the middle, just finished at the waist and emptied, finished off at the upper arm. But what I also like to highlight is in the drawings, he's wearing, of course, the trade patola that came in huge quantities. In later images, you see a lot of this, but this trade patola is not seen at all in any of the sculptures that we're looking at, but was seen at this period. Now, to finish off the central Java, here is the map showing where all the sculptures exist today, the different names of the Chandi and the name of the sculpture that appears in there and the material that they appear in. This was quite a feat to create this map because every single place I had to give a GPS code to the person who made the map for him to place exactly where each Chandi was and where each sculpture was found. So it took a lot of work to get this correctly done, but I think it's come out quite well, and I hope many of you will find it useful. So I want to show you these three Ganesha, quite different conditions, because there are a lot of Ganesha in Central Java, many of them, and of course they went through to the Kadiri period, as I talked of earlier. And we have the sculptures here are quite detailed patterns, but mostly rosette flowers. And the one in the middle here, this comes from, is seen in Calcutta. So most of you won't have seen this. And the sash across the body, of course, is quite detailed. It looks as though you can almost feel it and touch it. It's so soft. Again, with roundel designs, with this one, that the pattern becomes quite sophisticated. So in the next one, we have three stone statues as well. The outside two remain in situ, and the one in the middle is in the Santa Barbara Museum in California. Again, the sculptor knows exactly what it's doing. The patterning is quite distinctive, and the cloths are really quite detailed. If we look at this one, which remains in situ, you can see here the design is quite clear and quite stands proud from the body. So I suspect these are representing some form of Indian cotton because we're looking at the earliest 9th, 10th century. These three pieces, I'm putting them up because of their brocaded design. We have two options here. Java, we know, was making ikat textiles at this early period. We know this from the SEMA charters that Wiseman Christie discussed. We also know that brocaded ikat textiles were made in India and may have come in. But I also know that at this period, they were making brocade or sonket or woven textile. And that's the example I put here. Compliments, I looked at Sim Tam's collection in Kuala Lumpur many years ago. I don't know if he's listening, but he had the most extraordinary collection of sonket. And this was the only one I ever found where the sonket is actually in horizontal bands, which is quite unusual for Songket, which is the kind of design we're seeing on the textile. And then just briefly, in Sri Lanka, we also find a small Buddhist Lokeshwar here with the same textile in bands. So as I've highlighted on the map, Sri Lanka, of course, was part of the Buddhist trade route. It's a very Buddhist country. So there is certainly the ideas would have traveled both ways. What I need to highlight is that not everything came from India to Java. There were many of the ideas that you see in India started in Java and went to India. So there's many people have started to think this way round, and I also propose that a lot of the patterns that we see in Java ended up in Tibet at a slightly later period, but the inspiration came from Java itself. So just briefly to remind you of the landscape, where there are chandis all through the rice paddies, and of course the inevitable volcanoes. And then the East Javanese period. So in chapter 4, at the end of it, or I think at the beginning of the chapter, is the map showing where all the East Javanese sculpture remain, very much clustered in the Malang area, which was the heart of the Singhasari and the Majapahit period. This was quite a feat to get these all together, quite difficult to pinpoint each one, but I think they're as accurate as they can be. Now, I just want to briefly talk about design in museums. It's a big issue in museums, especially the National Museum in Jakarta, and this is saying nothing against the museum itself, who has the most extraordinary collection. But when we go in there as a student to study, what you're seeing is row upon row of sculpture that are not put in any particular cohesive grouping. The labeling says what it is, what the date is, and that's about it. So a lot of the time you have really no idea what you're looking at if you don't already have some idea yourself. So I think there is a lot of work to be done in museums worldwide to try and improve what we're looking at. So in a comparison, again, the same sculptures which we're going to look at again at the moment, and these originate from Chandi Jaga on the left. And so does this little piece of Mamaki, which was in the British Museum and still is, but now it's gone back into storage because in their reconditioning of the British Museum, very sadly, they took away all the Southeast Asian material and left the Hotung Gallery as Indian material only. So we have none of the rich pieces that were in the British Museum and part of the Raffles collection are all now in storage. So I was very happy to be able to see her, the Mamaki. So I want you to look, just remember this textile pattern that we see here. And then the next slide, I'm going to show you the detailed patterns from these three pieces. So I'm just showing you the detail of the lower leg. This was quite tough for Yiran to draw. As you can see from the drawings, please be reminded that these are hand-drawn. These are not done by computer. She does them because she's an artist and a draftsperson, and she's worked them out by sheer geometry. But what it tells you is that the artisans of the day knew exactly what they were doing. How did they create these incredibly complex designs on stone sculpture? Because the uninitiated might look at these and think, oh yes, very nice, just pretty patterns. But these are not just pretty patterns. This is a textile. Look at the way the cloth folds here. It's so soft you can actually feel it. The way the sash comes down at the side of the body and the chain belt hangs over it with the plain soft sash across the front of the body. I put a couple of samples on the left here, which come from Central Asia from an earlier period, where this idea of these thin lozenges in this kind of design has already been known at a much earlier period. I was fortunate enough to go to this place called the Abegg Stiftung. I had 3 days research there, which if you're a research student, they will pay for you to go. You don't have to, they have no fee yourself. They look after you, they feed you and give you board and lodging, and you can sit there with the library all day, every day. It was the most extraordinary experience of my life, and it was because of this I was able to date a lot of these sculpture designs patterns back to Central Asia, something we don't see here in Java at all. Having said that, these designs are much more familiar and much similar to a pattern called Bala Kacang. For some of you must know, it comes from West Sumatra in the Minangkabau area. And the famous artist and architecture and weaving specialist Bernard Barth and his wife had set up a studio in Bukit Tinggi. And he has spent many years researching the complex methodology and the mathematical layout of these particular designs, which I suspect is another whole story that I don't have time to go into as to why these patterns on Central Javanese sculpture probably come from West Sumatra patterning. But if you're interested, I can explain that a little bit more afterwards. Now this figure, this Mahakala, is the other partner to the Singhasari guardian figure that we saw earlier, the Nandishvara, that stands at the entrance to Chandisinghasari. Now he has a completely different patterning. What's interesting about these two is if you think of a building, an Indian temple building, and you have two guardian figures, they will always look the same. In Japan or China, any form of Buddhist art or Hindu art, the guardian figures would be a pair. They would be the same. They would dress the same. But in this instance, they're completely and totally different, which is quite extraordinary to me. And these are the last one of my babies. I'll show you. And look at the detail of the textile pattern. Here is the upper body garment of which wears the short jacket again. And let me highlight it for you. You can see it finishes here at the shoulder and finishes here at the upper body with the belt across it. So it's very corpulent, wears the sash across the body, and this cloth that tied around the waist. I've been looking at these statues for over 10 years now, and it still makes me excited seeing them. It's just the artisan work on here is just quite extraordinary. 4 different textile designs on one sculpture. It's just amazing. That the artisan did this, that they had these different designs in front of them, that they want to create something so prestige. But what of this hip wrapper? I propose that what we're seeing here is a Grinsing Kawung. This design is actually today called Papari. But in the text, we know that a Xinjiang Grinsing Kawung is a protective cloth. We know that the Kidung and a lot of the Kakawin literature talk about this textile, and we know that this was a protective textile. So it makes a lot of sense that a figure protecting a royal Chandi would wear such a cloth as this. That is a proposal that I have made. We're also seeing the Banji design here again across the bottom of one of the patterns on the sculpture himself. And we look briefly at 2 Ganesha. Both of these come from Chandisinghasari. This piece here is now in the National Museum at Bangkok and was given to King Chulalongkorn on one of his second visit to Java in the late 19th century. But what's interesting, these sculptures have 3 different textile designs. They both wear an upper body garment. This is what you're looking at here, is the upper body garment, with this peepal leaf design on the belt that goes across the upper body. This is the pattern here. But it's the design on the knee that I just adore. They wear a trouser, not a long lower body cloth. And this design represents what we're seeing here, a one-eyed Kala. This is unique only to this period in East Java. We never see this in India. It doesn't carry on to Majapahit, and it was never in Central Java. And it's unique to this Singhasari period. But where we see this also is in these 2 statues. The one on the right is known as the Karangatis Ganesha, remains in situ in a small desa in East Java. I visited a couple of times. Considering it's been outside, it's probably moved from the original position, but he's remained in situ all this time, and he's in pretty good condition. But for the uninitiated, you'll go and have a look and you'll study his ornamentation and you think he looks great. But what's going on down here? So if I highlight this for you, if you look very closely, can you see here? Here, his cloth goes to his ankle. There is a textile design in chains or rantais, as I like to call them. That's the local Malay word. But the Mahakala on the left has the same idea. If you look at the two together, very similar, soft carving, completely different to the rest of the deep 3D carving that we've been seeing before. And these are the two designs that we see on these two cloths. So this pattern is referred to as Chandra Kapala, Kapala being the head and Chandra being the moon. So the scholar Pauline Lucien-Schurler has done some work on this and has written a number of articles about this Chandra Kapala. I think we're also dealing with Ganeshas who date back to the whole concept of ancestor worship with Javanese ancestors way before Hindu and Buddhism came into this period. But the other aspect I want to briefly point out is on the tall Mahakala here, he has a different sash across the body. And I will highlight this for you now. And if you look carefully, this is the Chandra Kapala motif, but the motif on the sash is completely different. Isn't that an extraordinary thing? You think about anybody who carves something, they think, oh, they just make it all the same, nothing particular detailed. These artisans knew what they were doing. They were copying something that had to mean something. They weren't just making patterns. And the designs here that, again, Bernard Barth has worked on represent something that we see in the Minang weaving of the Minangkabau in Bukit Tinggi. But it's the sort of design that we don't see in East Coast of Malaysia or Palembang sculptures. And the connection with the Minangkabau and West Sumatra is very strong with this statue, but that's not something I have time to go into now. So we're coming near to the end. Now I'm going to show you the two Prajaparamita. The one on the right is the most famous of all, probably the national image of Java and their most famous piece. And she's, apart from her hand, she's in perfect condition. This is a photograph that's come, the standard museum photograph. But when you actually look at the study of her textile pattern, this is what we're seeing. Now, of course, this picture doesn't show it very clearly because it's a museum picture, so the resolution is not very good. But across the hip here and folding down the side of the body are two sashes. This is just showing one of them. And Yuran realized that each design was different. Each design is different. This is a brocaded material. This is definitely what we're seeing here because it's very thick and heavy and stands proud from the body. The example I put here is just to show you the type of designs that have been known way back from Sogdiana in Panjikent. And the Sogdian designs we know travel through China, so quite easily could have ended up through the Yuan period where there was a lot of trade through Kublai Khan down to Java. Now this Prajaparamita is very damaged, remains at here at Chandiputri under her small pavilion, and she's been written about a number of times, but nobody's noticed that she actually had a carved textile pattern. So if I highlight to you, now I'm afraid in this picture you're not going to see it, but on her knee here, the design is still quite clear. We know this is Prajaparamita because the lotus ends up coming around her arm and because her hands would have been in Dharma Chakra Mudra together at the middle. So actually she's later than the classic period at this one, 1362, but Yuran came out with a design like this, which is very detailed. So she's also representing a role figure and has been written about and published by Natasha Rischler in her book. So you can read more about her at that period. Then I want to highlight these two sculptures. This one on the left and the one on the right both remain in situ at Chandisinghasari, outside, very damaged, very worn by the weather. This piece, I've written a small article in a Dutch publication. It's also on my academia site if you want to know more about them, where they're known as the lost patterns or the designs that have disappeared. So the sculpture at the top here there is a textile pattern very faintly on the knee here, and this would actually have been a royal figure with a lot of ornamentation on it that's almost completely disappeared. So when I bring you down to the design, you can see how the interlocking circles here are very clear, with the detail of the sash coming down from the front of the body. So the pattern is quite extraordinary, and again, a one-off on its own, a very interesting brocaded design. Now at the top here, this is a Dikpala or a guardian of the universe, and all we have left is the legs. And this was published by Brandes in 1904. So if we have a look at the detail of this one, in his drawing at the top here, you can see the pattern is quite clear. You knew that it was interlocking circles. When I first got to see it in 2014, the design had almost completely disappeared. The black lichen, of course, which is terrible for the sculptures, it just eats away at the stone, but there is a faint line here at the bottom. So between the drawing at the top and what we see today, Johan was able to portray the textile pattern. So, of course, what my book has been able to do is to keep hold of these designs, because these sculptures will eventually lose their designs completely. And so we'll be able to have a record of the patterns. And then right at the end, we come to the Majapahit sculptures. And now, because these have been in the museum for so long, they're in good conditions. These would have remained inside a Chandi, this large figure of Harihara as a king. And we're having portrait statues, what's referred to as portrait statues, but they're actually deified figures of ancestors. They always stand in a very stilted upright position, and they always have different versions of a classic Kung design. And many of the texts, and in Javanese philosophy, the word Sinjang Kung is a cloth to protect the world. And the king and queen equals a god, and so he needs to wear this type of cloth to protect the world, i.e. his people and his status. So hence all the Majapahit textiles sculptures all have, as I showed you from the charts early on, these types of Kung designs. But a number of people have said to me that this pattern comes today from the Arenga Pinata, the inside of this plant, and this is where you get the motif from for batik patterns. But is that what they were looking at in the 14th century? Of course, we don't know. But the concept of interlocking circles has been known right back for 2,000 years to the Harappan period in Western India. So it's not a new idea, but every different dynasty, period, people, or religion have taken this motif and deemed it to be their own and had their own meaning and interpretation for it. So right at the end, we go to the Majapahit period. He has a partner exactly the same at Chandi Panataran. You remember I showed you the picture earlier. And we look at the detail on this sculpture. It's very clear. The Kung design carries over on the sash. You can see he's big, strong, and heavy, with extraordinary detail in the chain belt and the way the cloth is made to fold at the front. So we know that this sculpture is wearing a textile that's solid. It's not a flimsy cloth by any means. And he stands outside, and he would wear a brocaded textile of some sort to deem, as a guardian figure of a royal temple. And then on the right, we have a royal figure, that couple that sits in the back corner hidden corner of the National Museum. It's one of my favorite statues. Unfortunately, it's quite damaged, but this is a royal couple. She is seated on his knee. He is crouching down, and she's seated on his knee, comes out underneath here. It's quite badly damaged. The textile is hardly visible except for around the back and the side and underneath her leg. So remember, this is not Shiva and Parvati. This is a royal couple together. But here is the detail of the pattern, and we're looking at a simplistic Kung design, which is reflected very much in textiles today. And then you move forward another few centuries, and you come right to the end of the Majapahit, and now we get the images of Bhima and Kotolo, and I just show you this one. with Bhima wearing what is quite evidently a poleng. Around the hip, just covers his genitals. These statues are always virtually naked apart from this hip cloth that comes down the front. Wearing it almost exactly like we see this guardian figure in Bali. So we know that poleng textiles were written about in the text, and this is the only evidence we have of them actually being worn. And right at the end of my book, in the epilogue, I produced a diaspora of the sculptures so that you can see where all the sculptures remain today, in which museums, what they're made of, and where they are situated. So if you're doing a world trip and want to see where these are, now you know where to go. So to conclude, in the last 120 years, we've had 2 world wars and many local political struggles for independence. During this period, the amount of scholarship which has been completed, especially on East Java, has been very small. Important work, but very few compared to the previous century. Of course, these past works are out of print and not available, and mostly in Old Dutch or German, and not accessible to the average student. So I'm hoping that my book has been able to draw on these past scholars, especially on J.L.A. Brandes, and has been able to bring to the reader something fresh and new, which has not been written about before in Javanese art history tradition. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Dr. Pullen for a very, very rich and comprehensive presentation relating textiles that we know so much from contemporary examples to possibly the roots of them from her very intensive study on classical sculpture. And we could see from her presentation that we had a very vibrant textile trades in Southeast Asia about 1,000 years ago, and so many different kinds of things came into Southeast Asia. Not because Southeast Asians didn't weave or didn't like to weave, but I think the Southeast Asians traditionally just had a penchant, had a love for all kinds of textiles, exotic ones to colorful ones. So again, I want to thank Dr. Pullen for pulling together all the rich materials, and I think it's only someone like Dr. Pullen with very strong grasp of textiles, pattern, and knowledge which enabled her to draw some of these conclusions that she saw on sculptures. So actually, I think Lesley, your talk is so comprehensive that you've actually covered, you've actually answered quite a few questions that were raised while you were talking on the chat box. But for example, the Kawong pattern, while you probably wouldn't venture into suggesting that the Kawong pattern that you see on the sculptures were batik, but it sort of hinted on where batik Kawong pattern had come from. Do you want to add more to that? Because I think that's where the intensive interest is.
Yes. The batik and Kawong seem to be synonymous with Java, and of course it's raised everybody's interest. I think what I have to highlight is that Jan Wiseman Christie's work talks about Tuliswana. We know that the Javanese were drawing with color. We know that right in the Sunda people in West Sumatra draw with color very simple batik patterns. And we know that cotton in the early days, of course, was only a hand-spun cotton. So to draw with color, you can only do fairly crude designs. You can't make fine batik that you see today, which is how you see a lot of the Sunda batik, the early pieces. So to draw with color and to create designs as fine as you're seeing on some of these sculptures, it had to have been something else and not this version. So I think the whole Kawong design came in only later because I think the Central Javanese obviously didn't deem it as something that had a meaning to them. and that it's only in the East Javanese period that this interlocking circle design obviously meant something to them. Hence what I described, it's used as a protective garment and used by the kings. So it's a combination of what do the texts tell us, what do we see on the sculpture, how is it possible to make these? And so batik and kawung, batik is such a loaded word because it's not just the technique, but it's the pattern. What you're wearing, of course, Cholin, is a batik pattern. Of course, I can't see from here, and I'm sure it is batik. So it's batik. It's a discussion, which something I know all Singaporeans love to have.
Yes, yes. So there's also a question that was that you focused on the poverty that sculpture that you were talking about, and the questions was raised on whether you could relate that to the sort of patterns you see produced in Kalimantan.
Oh, patterns in Kalimantan. What patterns especially does someone refer to?
Unfortunately, that it wasn't very specific, but I could sort of deduce that the person could have referred to maybe the Iban textiles, the poor.
Highly unlikely. You have to remember what we're dealing with here is court culture. Court culture was influenced by traders because a lot of court culture was coastal region. The littoral was coastal. Trade came up the rivers. So the Iban are ethnic minority who were upriver. Tribal people would have not been affected by court cultural and by coastal traders. So no, I wouldn't put those two together at all.
Okay, thank you. There is also a very long question from Mr. Doug Finn. So I'll just read it out for you. Are there designs particular to local Indonesian culture, i.e. what the wealthy might actually wear, or do they have a wider religious significance? I believe you touched on this. For example, some patterns on the Bodhisattva Padmapani, Lokeshvara from Nepal and from 11th to 12th century have similar designs. Many Buddhist and Hindu deities are wrathful, so none of the Indonesian statues seem to be wrathful in nature. Is this so? If so, is there a reason for it? But if you could handle it in a few minutes.
In a few words. There are wrathful statues. Indonesian, if you think of the two guardian figures at Chandisinghasari, one is Nandishvara and one's Mahakala. They're both images of Shiv, and Mahakala is the wrathful version, even though he doesn't look very wrathful. The only thing we know that he's a wrathful figure is because he had big hair and rather bulbous eyes. The wrathful figures never appear quite so prominently in Java, but there are wrathful figures, and there is no textile difference between one and the other. And something I didn't highlight, there's no difference between male and female, Hindu or Buddhist, or wrathful or not in the patterns at all.
So the other question I think refers to how you can relate the patterns you see, the textile patterns you see on sculpture, to perhaps contemporary or modern Indonesian culture. I think perhaps, you know, the idea that the gods, because most of these statuaries refer to are representations of deities, and when human represent deities, you wouldn't leave them in plain clothes. You have to adorn them. So the adornment, the ideas of adornment would have come from what they see being worn by the upper echelon of the society.
Yes, absolutely. It's sad to say, but the average everyday person, which is you, me, and everybody out there listening, doesn't count for anything in this world. We don't count. It's completely irrelevant what we wore. And in fact, The most interesting publication is the Zhu Fanxi, which was written the 11th, 12th century, which was all about Chinese traders. And he often refers to in that what the everyday man wore. So the prestige of that question, of course, the sculptures reflected the upper echelon. They reflected the Rajas, the princes, everybody, the textiles that came in that was only there available to the wealthy, basically.
Mm. Well, on this note, I think Lesley, I have to really thank you. You've been talking nonstop for about 90 minutes, and you do have a fan club here, and I would encourage Mr. Doug Finn to perhaps contact Lesley, and you could have a much more sort of fruitful conversation, because your questions are multiple and quite complex, and I would encourage you to reach out to Lesley personally if you don't mind. So on that note, I'd like to pass the floor back to Gwen to round up the session this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lesley. Thank you, Cholin, for moderating. Sorry, Gwen is still having problems with her microphone, so I'll just be doing the closing. Yeah, so again, thank you everyone for coming down this afternoon and spending time listening to this insightful presentation by Dr. Lesley. And thank you, Cholin, again for moderating the questions. We just have some housekeeping notes before we end off the session. So we have a next event called Dalam Dapur with Alex Wong. It's on the 25th of September at 10 a.m. That would be, hang on, 25th of September would be a Saturday. So that's on a weekend. Alex Wong is from the US, and he'll be speaking about this on this event. So yeah, so you can see the poster here, which is about pineapples. So again, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Dr. Lesley. Thank you, Cholin. Everyone have a pleasant weekend. Thank you.
May I ask the question? Is it possible for me to keep a record of the questions? Because there are many questions that I would love to be able to answer.
Sure, we can write them down. Yeah, and we'll field it to you.
Yeah, we will do an extraction for you and send it to you by email.
Please, yes, that would be really good, because I'd like to be able to answer some of them. I don't know how I can answer them because people, online, of course, so how would I answer it?
Yeah, we will extract it for you and send it to you. Yeah, not to worry.
Okay, good. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And everyone, if you haven't joined the Peranakan Association, it is open to everyone. So please join us if you like our event. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cholin, very much for all your kind words. It was really great. I think I went on too long. I even made my presentation shorter. It's very hard to make this subject compacted. There's so much to say.
Well, we learned so much more that way from you. I can't see how much shorter you can, make it. Really, you do need the full range of pictures and images to compare. But it got me thinking on quite a few things. So thank you very much.
Oh, good. Well, but we can have a discussion ourselves.
Yes.
Some other time.
Exactly. I have a few things I want to discuss with you about songket.
Yes.
Your idea of songket being represented, and also the origins of batik. Since when would batik be represented on statuaries like that?
Yeah,
things like that. So
yes, okay, we have to do that. And I can see from many of the questions, that's of course for Malays and Javanese, that is the $1 million question.
Yeah.
The sculpture has brought some of that to life, certainly by things you wouldn't have seen otherwise. But
right.
Anyhow, we can do it again.
Yes.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Lesley.
Okay.
Have a brilliant weekend.
I will indeed. It's been fun. Thank you so much. And I'm very sad not to say goodbye to Gwen.